The Arturia MicroFreak might just be the perfect synth for me. Quick disclaimer before we get into the video, Arturia did send me the MicroFreak over a year ago, but I haven't really had contact with them since, and they're not paying me to make this video, nor did they ask me to make it. And at this point, knowing what I know now, I would have happily bought the MicroFreak with my own money. So let's talk about it. I actually don't own as many synths as one would think a synth YouTuber would. I tend to put a lot more focus on groove boxes, as I like the kind of all-in-one portable workflow, and those have their own synth engines, and so they do still count, but it's definitely a different purpose, and so I don't own a ton of dedicated synths in the traditional sense, and the MicroFreak is one of the few of them. So when looking for a synth, I want something that's fairly versatile and it can do kind of pretty evolving sounds for kind of synthwave and more vintage stuff, and can do some more aggressive, chaotic, or gritty sounds. And I want something inexpensive. I do like that electronic music is somewhat low overhead, and I want to kind of adhere to that. Obviously, in this niche, you can spend a ton of money, but I prefer not to. I prefer to try to go for budget stuff if I can, especially because that's also easier for me to recommend to an audience. And if I'm going to spend extra time, money, and space on hardware, I want it to have something unique about it, something that quite literally and metaphorically pushes the envelope. Fortunately, the MicroFreak ticks all three of these boxes. So let's go into it a little more in depth. The Arturia MicroFreak has a ton of different sound generation engines within it, and this makes it incredibly versatile. Starting off with the more traditional, it's got a few engines that have the standard wave shapes and some nice supersaws, some nice virtual analog stuff, and that pairs very well with the filter. And I'll talk about that right now. If I was to try to pick out an analog filter in a blind filter shootout, I probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference, but the filter does sound quite nice, especially with the resonance cranked a little bit, as you heard at the very beginning of this video, and it definitely complements the virtual analog engines quite well, providing the basis for some nice vintage chill sounds. Those sounds can be taken even further and made to evolve in some really cool ways, but I'll get back to that in the section of this video about modulation. There's also the 2-operator FM engine. There's some physical modeling in there, which is pretty unique. Kind of reminds me of some of the stuff on the OP1, and the heaviness kicks in even further with the wavetable engine, which I should mention can do pretty evolving sounds as well, but I especially like it for making incredibly gritty basses. Just modulating the wavetable position can be enough on its own to make for a pretty intense bass. Once you start modulating more elements and then even bringing it into post and adding effects, you can take this pretty far. What you're about to hear was heavily processed, so this is not something you'd get right out of the MicroFreak, but it is a pretty cool example of what it can become with enough time and effort. The synth engines just by themselves are very powerful and very versatile, and I'm a fan of that, obviously. There are a couple of duds in there. I rarely use the speech one, although if I want some kind of glitchy elements, that can come in clutch, but all of this can be taken much farther and into much prettier or weirder places with modulation. The modulation on the MicroFreak is lovely. It's got a very nicely laid out mod matrix that you can assign to pretty much anything, and it's got enough envelopes and LFOs to make pretty complex sounds with a lot of moving parts. It's got the standard ADSR envelope, it's got the cycling envelope, which can either function like an envelope or like an LFO. It's got the actual LFO, which can have some very normal shapes like sine and square waves, and some more chaotic shapes. I will get back to that. And it's got the pressure sensitivity, or how much skin is applied to the touch plate, and that can be used to modulate elements as well, as you heard in the jam that introduced this section. And you can even modulate modulation sources, which is really cool. I don't really have much of a desire to get into modular synthesis, but I definitely like some of the chaotic, complex, moving sounds that you can get out of it. And the MicroFreak brings the best bits of that, in my opinion, into an entirely self-contained device. The mod matrix makes it very intuitive to create very complicated sounds, and I think that's really cool. The MicroFreak is not just for playing stuff that you already came up with or for riffing around on, it's also good at actually generating musical ideas. It's got the built-in arpeggiator and sequencer. The sequencer works kind of like the endless sequencer on the OP1. I'm sure there's an actual precursor to that, but the OP1 is the reference point that I'm familiar with. But let's get back to the arpeggiator, because this thing can do a lot more than just bounce between notes. It's got a spice and dice option. Dice basically rolls the dice for randomness, randomly triggering or not triggering notes. And then Spice takes that even further. Pair this with some of the more chaotic LFO shapes, and you can create some pretty random generative sounds, much like on a modular setup, that change every time you hold the key down. The Psytrance jam that you heard at the beginning of this section is a great example. I dialed in the LFO to modulate the cutoff, and then I set the arpeggiator with Spice and Dice turned up so that it would randomly trigger or not trigger certain notes. And then I just held down the note repeatedly. I would hold it down for a little bit, stop, hold it down again until it spat out a cool pattern that I was able to build that drop around. The MicroFreak is also capable of some percussive sounds, so you could take this even further by modulating stuff like pitch and create entire grooves using this process, which is incredibly powerful and somewhat unique to something this inexpensive. The MicroFreak is not only a beautiful icy pad creator, but a very capable little chaos machine as well, which I value both very highly, and so having the modulation and the generative aspects of it all brought together with these oscillators is incredibly powerful and exactly what I want in a hardware synth. Maybe gripes is a strong word. This is more things that would be cool to include in a future version. First of all, I do want to mention something that isn't a gripe for me, oddly enough. I mentioned earlier in the video that I actually like the key bed, and I 100% stand by that. I am maybe slightly biased in that I'm not natively a piano player, so your mileage might vary, but I think it's actually really fun to play and offers some very unique possibilities. I don't find the lack of a traditional keyboard annoying at all. A couple of things I would love to see in a MicroFreak 2 or like a Polyfreak would be, for one thing, true polyphony, and really the paraphonic is only partially paraphonic. It's nowhere near as limiting as it is on something like the Volca keys, and for the most part I never even notice it, but having true polyphony would be cool. And there are no onboard effects on the MicroFreak, and of course you can get around this. I typically process stuff in post anyway, and you can always pair it with a pedal if you're into that kind of thing, but including some reverb, delay, maybe a bit of distortion, maybe a kind of a stereo chorus would be really neat. Definitely not essential, but it's something I would like to see in a future version, should such a thing exist. It's pretty damn good already, and if Arturia decided to just stop there, I would totally understand that. And finally, this is not really a gripe for me, but it might be for other people. It definitely has its own distinctive sound. It can sometimes sound ever so slightly on the metallic side, maybe not as warm as some people would prefer, maybe not quite as analog as some people would prefer despite the analog filter, and I think Noir described it best when he said it has cold, icy tones. It does, and that's fair. And you do have to kind of work within its sound. And some people are going to be turned off by it. Some people are going to like it for its distinctive sound. I definitely like it for the most part, although sometimes I do find myself fighting some of its harshness just a little bit. Hopefully the audio examples you heard in this video give you a decent idea of what it can sound like. That is it for today's video. If you'd like to see the actual music making process with the Arturia MicroFreak that I've done, you can click or tap up over here. I've got a couple videos on that you can check out with your eyeballs if you'd like. And as always, you can check out my $5 sample pack linked in the description, or an affiliate link to Zounds to check out the price of the MicroFreak. That is it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.